This is a CNA podcast.
Hello and welcome to CNA Correspondent. In this episode, the football-mad country of Indonesia stripped of hosting the FIFA Men's Under-20 World Cup. It was the first time Indonesia would host an international football tournament. It beat bids by Brazil and Peru and meant a spot for Indonesia at football's top table, something the national team hasn't come close to in decades. The tournament was also to move Indonesia's footballing story forward, away from past international headlines of corruption, political interference, and most recently, a stadium disaster that killed 135 spectators. And yet, just 8 weeks before the tournament kicks off in May, FIFA has stepped in and said no. So what happened? Leading up to the tournament draw in Bali, the island's governor, Wayan Koster, made a written protest over Israel's participation in the tournament, which led to physical protests in Jakarta. You see, Indonesia has no diplomatic ties with Israel, and the world's most populous Muslim country is a supporter of the Palestinian cause. In light of the protests and the implied security concerns for the Israeli contingent, FIFA had to act.
Of course, FIFA looks at this as a kind of intervention because many times FIFA metes out punishment when there is a government intervention. This is a form of such intervention, and in the contract as a host country and host city which we signed, we had guaranteed safety, and that is perhaps one of FIFA's considerations too.
That was Eric Thohir, chairman of the Indonesian Football Association, explaining FIFA's decision. But I still have more questions. And to help answer them, I'm joined by CNA's Indonesia correspondent, Saifulbahri Ismail. Saiful, thanks for chatting with me today.
Hi, Steve.
Now, Saiful, was it a surprise or a shock that FIFA decided to strip Indonesia of hosting this Under-20 World Cup after all these protests?
Well, it's not a surprise that FIFA had removed Indonesia from hosting the tournament because FIFA had to act quickly and decisively to ensure the safety of the Israeli team. Now, one thing was for sure, FIFA was never going to accede to the demands of the protesters, and that was never an option for FIFA. Argentina has recently been confirmed as the new host of the tournament, replacing Indonesia. Now, on 29th of March, FIFA announced on its website that it has decided, due to current circumstances, to remove Indonesia as the host of the tournament. FIFA did not explain what it exactly meant by current circumstances, and it did not make any direct references to the controversy in Indonesia about Israel taking part. Now, if we analyze a little deeper what FIFA meant by current circumstances, I don't think they were referring to the Kanjuruhan Stadium stampede in Malang, East Java province last October. Indonesia had escaped sanctions from FIFA following that tragedy, so it has to be recent events that had happened, and that could only mean the disagreement on Israel's participation in the tournament. Now, earlier you mentioned about the governor of Bali, Wayan Koster, who had publicly rejected the presence of the Israeli national team on the island. Now, Mr. Koster is seeking re-election in the gubernatorial election next year, so this could also be a factor in trying to understand his actions. Now, Bali was supposed to house one of the 6 soccer stadiums for the tournament, and the predominantly Hindu province was expected to accommodate the Israeli team. But the Bali governor was not the only politician who did not want the Israelis' participation in the competition. Soon after, Central Java Governor Ganjar Pranowo also spoke out against having the Israelis in Indonesia. Now, Mr. Ganjar is a more prominent figure than the Bali governor, and by speaking out against the Israelis, he automatically raised the political stakes on the issue. Now, both Mr. Costa and Mr. Ganjar are from the same political party, which is the Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle, or PDIP. Now, it is the ruling party in Indonesia, and FIFA may have regarded these two politicians as voices from the government, and thus this is seen as a form of intervention from the government. Now, Bali and Central Java were also 2 of 6 provinces that were supposed to host the matches, and with the governors of these 2 provinces rejecting the Israeli team, FIFA may have considered this as failure on the part of the local government to honor its commitment to organize the competition. Now, it is also useful to note that Indonesia was not the only country that got its hosting rights revoked by FIFA. On 3rd April, FIFA withdrew Peru's hosting rights to the Under-17 World Cup, which is scheduled to take place from 10th November to 2nd December this year. FIFA said the move was made given the inability of the host country to fulfill its commitments to completing the infrastructure required to stage the tournament, it has been determined that there is now not sufficient time to secure the required investment and complete the necessary work with the Peruvian government ahead of the tournament. Now, what is also interesting to note is that FIFA did not punish Peru for failing to provide proper infrastructure for the tournament, but in Indonesia's case, FIFA had punished the Indonesian Football Association by freezing their development fund given by FIFA, which means that FIFA views Indonesia's case as a more serious offense.
Yeah, interesting that the sort of political angle would be deemed more serious than the infrastructure angle, and it'd be interesting to see how that plays out for Indonesia and the consequences that it'll have, and we'll discuss it a bit later on as well. But what was the initial reaction then by Indonesians by and large? Because as we know, interest in football in the country is huge.
That's right, Steve. Many Indonesians were obviously clearly upset with the decision. Football is a popular sport in Indonesia and people want to watch and attend these games in the stadiums. Now, fans were clearly disappointed, and there was a group called the People's Football Movement who held a vigil of 1,000 candles, and they performed prayers, showed solidarity and expressed hope for the future of football in the country. But no one felt more devastated than the players themselves. Many took to social media to vent their anger. Critical comments were directed primarily at the two PDIP politicians, Mr. Costa and Mr. Ganjar. Now, one of the players said in a YouTube video that these politicians don't know how hard the players worked, and so they shouldn't express their opinions recklessly because the players are the ones who suffer the consequences. Now, these players had to compete with more than 100 others across Indonesia to be in the national team. Only 23 players made it to the final squad. Now, the young team had trained together for 2 years and participated in training camps abroad in Turkey, South Korea and Spain. Pundits also weighed in, saying that the tournament had been a windfall for Indonesia to make history and showcase its local talents and come out to the radar of international football clubs. Now, as during such big matches, football scouts from various countries are always looking out for young talent. So now these Indonesian players might have lost that chance. Personally, I was also disappointed. I was actually looking forward to watching the games in Indonesia. I'm a big football fan and it was a chance.
I can tell you're a big football fan, Saiful. And I'll tell our viewers why. I can tell because Saiful has a big poster behind his head of a football team on his wall. Saiful, you want to tell everyone who that is?
Oh, that's right. That's Liverpool. That picture was taken when the team won the Champions League. There was quite a good moment for football fans, especially myself.
Yeah. So football fans, I mean, people that love football, and as much as possible want to keep politics out of it. And as you mentioned, this was billed as the tournament of tomorrow's superstars, and these young players were going to be, on the global stage playing big international established teams. And because Indonesia was hosting, they would be able to play in a tournament that they may not ordinarily have qualified for.
That's right, Steve. These players who are under 20 years old in the competition, in the tournament, may be considered boys, but they represent the future of football in their respective countries. Professional football players do not have many years in their career. Most of them retire from playing professional football in their late 30s, and that's why they usually start at the top level very young when they are in their teens. Now, the last Under-20 World Cup was held in Poland in 2019. Now, one of the stars during that tournament was Norwegian player Erling Haaland.
I think I've heard of him.
After scoring a record of 9 goals in a single match, probably not many people know who Haaland was back then, but look at Haaland now. The Manchester City player has developed into a devastating goal-scoring machine with superhuman ability. So the Under-20 World Cup is an important platform, and FIFA has build it as a tournament of tomorrow's superstars.
Yeah, that's right. We certainly know who Erling Haaland is now. Coming back to the sort of the politics side of it, we know that the players and football fans all wanted this tournament to happen. But why was there such strong opposition to Israel's participation in the competition? And how strong is the sentiment against Israel in Indonesia?
Well, Steve, anti-Israel sentiment in Indonesia, especially among groups of Muslims, is strong. We often see street demonstrations against the Israelis when there is an attack on the Palestinian people. Muslims here are not afraid to condemn the Israelis. Now, in fact, the Indonesian Foreign Ministry has just condemned the Israeli police for their recent attack on worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem during the holy month of Ramadan. But this football debacle goes beyond just anti-Israel sentiments in Indonesia, this has been hugely politicized. Now, even Palestinian ambassador to Indonesia said he had no objection to Israelis taking part in the tournament. Now, Israel's qualification to the tournament was known for a long time, even when Indonesia gave its commitment to host the competition. But strong rejection to the Israelis only surfaced recently within the last few months. At first, opposition to Israelis' participation had been minimal and manageable. It was restricted to just some street demonstrations by Muslim groups. But the tone changed when the governor of Bali, Iwayan Koster, voiced his rejection of the presence of the Israeli national team on the resort island. Now, this may seem strange because Bali, as you know, is a largely Hindu province and certainly not the traditional base for conservative Muslims. Central Java Governor Ganjar Pranowo also disapproved of the Israeli team. Now, Mr. Ganjar has a high electability rate in next year's presidential election, and his objection to Israelis' participation is seen also so out of character for a person who is so friendly and pleasant. Now, both Mr. Costa and Mr. Ganjar are from the PDIP, which is a nationalist party, not an Islamist party. So it was also strange for a nationalist party to play the religious card. Now, Mr. Ganjar explained that the nation needed to honor the wishes of first President Sukarno, who had supported the independence of Palestine. Sukarno is the father of PDIP's chairwoman Megawati Sukarno Putri. In the absence of any credible explanation, many speculate Mr. Costa and Mr. Ganjar were acting upon instructions from Ms. Megawati herself. Now, the PDIP strongly opposed the presence of the Israeli team because of its ideology, which was largely formulated by Sukarno, was against the establishment of Israel, for the country was then seen as a representation of Western colonialism. Now, in 1958, we go back to history, in 1958, then President Sukarno ordered the Indonesian team to withdraw from a qualification match with Israel for the World Cup in Sweden, citing the nation's solidarity with the Palestinian people. Now, the party said this is not about religion, but about independence as the right of all nations. So, PDIP members feel that they should follow and honor the party's history.
Saiful, this local context is invaluable to our listeners to hear about the domestic politics at play, that is the factors behind the scenes of all these developments that have been happening. As you mentioned, this protest only kicked off in the intensity in more recent months, but they did also become physical protests. And, we saw people on the streets. I saw strongly worded banners during the protests in Jakarta, sort of criticizing Israel and even drawing President Jokowi's name into things. How real was the security risk, though?
Yeah, there were protests in Jakarta, people demonstrating on the streets. Now, any security risk cannot be underestimated, right? I'm sure the security agencies in Indonesia have information, they have the intelligence to know how big the risk is. The PDIP has also cited potential terror attacks as one of the reasons for its opposition to the participation of Israel in the under-20 football competition, particularly in Bali, because Indonesia's worst terror attack happened in Bali more than 20 years ago when the Jemaah Islamiyah militant group struck 2 nightclubs, killing more than 200 people and injuring hundreds more. The party said there's less than zero tolerance of any potential security threat. Now, the Indonesian government had said that it did not see any threats against the Israel football team. Recently, Mujahir Effendi, who is the coordinating minister for Human Development and Culture Affairs, told Tempo magazine that many Israeli delegations have attended events in Indonesia, not only during Mr. Widodo's era, but also before that. But they were invited by international organizations. Mr. Mujahir said that Indonesia's Foreign Affairs Ministry has the requirements for Israeli delegations that enter Indonesia. Now, these include that Israelis do not play their national anthem and they do not display their flag. There was one other condition relevant to the football tournament which the Indonesian authorities told FIFA, that was that the Israeli team had to play in empty stadiums during the tournament. Now, authorities had guaranteed the safety of all teams participating in the Under-20 World Cup, including the Israeli team, during all activities in Indonesia. While it's hard to downplay the security threats posed by the global soccer event, the anti-terror operations launched by police in recent years are believed to have weakened local terrorist cells. Now, last year, the government successfully held the high-profile Group of 20 summit in Bali without any serious security incidents.
All right, thanks, Saiful. We're going to pause for breath for a moment. Next on CNA Correspondent, you'll hear President Jokowi's response to FIFA, and I'll ask Saiful about the future of Indonesian football.
Are you looking for ways to make your money work harder for you? Or need tips on saving, investing, and making financial decisions? Join me, Andrea Heng, on Money Talks, CNA's top personal finance podcast. From investment basics to the FIRE movement and legacy planning, Money Talks looks at financial trends and stories that matter to you. Check out our complete playlist on the CNA app, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us or subscribe for new episodes every Tuesday.
You're back with me, Steve Lai, and you're listening to how Indonesia was stripped of hosting the FIFA Men's Under-20 World Cup. Here's President Joko Widodo's response.
Saya sudah memerintahkan kepada
I've instructed the chairman of the Indonesian Football Association, PSSI, to prepare a blueprint, to prepare a roadmap to transform football in Indonesia, to be sent to FIFA immediately, and to continue communicating with FIFA, with the president of FIFA and its council, for us to not be sanctioned by FIFA.
Saifulbahri Ismail, CNA's Indonesia correspondent, is still with me. Saiful, what is the political fallout from this episode, and what else has President Jokowi said?
Well, Steve, Mr. Widodo has sought to appease the masses of disappointed soccer fans by saying that Indonesia as a whole must learn to look past this incident. He said the country needs to respect FIFA's decision. He said Indonesia must look to the future and not look back, and let this episode be a valuable lesson for everyone and for Indonesian football. Now, Mr. Widodo is also a member of the PDIP, and by continuing to allow the Israeli football team to come to Indonesia, he had chosen to break ranks with his party. Now, the Under-20 World Cup competition was supposed to be one of his biggest legacies, and he would not have wanted to taint his national and a global reputation. But it is incomprehensible how he had let the situation get out of control since he's a member of the PDIP. So this has been a slap on Mr. Widodo's face, actually, and an embarrassment of significant proportions. But he should be aware by now that his ruling coalition has never been more fractious, and this could spell trouble for the remainder of his presidency. It is unclear how this will impact Mr. Ganjar's electoral standing. While he may lose a lot of support for his 2024 presidential bid, particularly from soccer fans, he could also win new converts, particularly among conservative Muslim voters.
And are there larger consequences for Indonesia beyond just football?
Indeed, definitely. This episode will likely raise questions about Indonesia's credentials to host major international events. The country has big sporting ambitions, and as part of Mr. Widodo's long-term plans, Indonesia submitted in November last year a formal bid to host the 2036 Olympic Games. Jokowi has also previously expressed his dream for Indonesia to eventually host the World Cup. Talks are underway among several Southeast Asian nations, including Indonesia, to launch a joint bid to host the senior soccer tournament in 2034. So those dreams may need to take a backseat for now. The country's politicians may first need to exercise more caution and restraint in their statements, or they risk jeopardizing Indonesia's sporting ambitions in the long run. Now, there's also the economic element to Indonesia's failure to host the Under-20 World Cup event. The Tourism Ministry said that FIFA's decision has cost Indonesia 3.7 trillion rupiah. That's more than 369 million US dollars. This is the amount of funds the nation has already spent to renovate soccer stadiums, and the loss of a potential tourism boom that could have been generated by the global soccer event. Now, the government was eyeing 7.4 million unique visits from foreign tourists and 1.4 billion local holidaymakers throughout the year. There's also the loss of revenue from ticket sales on match days. The 6 stadiums that were supposed to be used for the tournament can accommodate a total of about 300,000 spectators. And even though the price of tickets has not been announced yet, this could still be a significant loss in revenue. There's also the loss of sponsorship deals and revenue from the sale of merchandise, jerseys, and other football accessories.
Yeah, it does certainly seem like a big loss for Indonesia on so many fronts, both in sort of its standing in the world, but also loss of the people that are on the ground that would benefit from having this tournament hosted by Indonesia. Going forward, though, what can Indonesia do to mitigate the possibility of more sanctions that might come from FIFA as a result of this seemingly incredibly last-minute decision to strip it as being host?
Well, Steve, a few days after FIFA stripped Indonesia from hosting the World Cup Under-20 competition, the chief of the Indonesian Football Association, Erick Thohir, flew to Paris in France to meet officials from FIFA in a bid to lobby for no sanctions on Indonesia. Mr. Erick tried to convince FIFA that Indonesia is serious about transforming football in the country. Mr. Erick showed officials from FIFA Indonesia's blueprint and roadmap, which includes various programs and potential of Indonesian football, long-term plans for tournaments from an early age, infrastructure improvements, and commercialization of football in the country. Now, despite Mr. Erick's efforts, FIFA punished Indonesia further by freezing a development fund it had given the country earlier. FIFA said that it provisionally recommended a restriction on the use of FIFA forward development funds for the Indonesian Football Association and would reconsider lifting the sanction after reviewing Indonesia's plan to improve on its football. Now, the fund was given to Indonesia in January this year, and the Football Association would have access to the fund until 2026. Now, the freezing of the fund would have an impact on the association's operations, but the possible financial loss is not likely to paralyze the association significantly. Observers said Mr. Erick, as a businessman and a politician, has more than enough resources and access to make up for any shortfall. The association was relieved that FIFA did not slap the country with a heavier penalty and got away with just an administrative sanction. Mr. Erick said that Indonesia has been lucky to escape with a yellow card instead of a red card. What this means is that Indonesia can still compete in international competitions, and the national team will be able to take part in the upcoming Southeast Asian Games or SEA Games in Phnom Penh in Cambodia in May. Now, some people may disagree with FIFA's actions or sanctions, saying that it has practiced double standards by not allowing earlier the Russian football team to participate in the World Cup last year because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that can also be seen as mixing sports with politics.
Yeah, it's getting increasingly hard going forward, Saiful, to separate sports from politics, given all the events that are happening around the world and all the conflicting countries that have varying interests as well. Saiful, one last question for you about the future of football in Indonesia. This must be seen as a setback for the domestic game.
Indeed, Steve. The future of football in Indonesia at the moment, at least in the short term, is not looking very good. Now, Indonesia has been down that road before, and that was painful. Now, in 2015, FIFA suspended Indonesia's membership over perceived government interventions in the Indonesian Football Association. The suspension was just over a year, but it left lasting damage to the nation's football world. Now, Indonesia had crawled back in its FIFA ranking from 179th in 2015 to 151st last year, which is still far from its historic best ranking of 76. Now, Indonesia is also barely in the top 5 among 11 Southeast Asian countries in this region. Now, after this year's Under-20 World Cup debacle, Indonesia can expect to see its ranking fall again. Indonesia have scored an own goal in playing political football. The referee may be giving a penalty against Indonesia, and even extra time may not help the country to win this game.
Saiful, so eloquently put. Thank you, as always, for speaking to us here on CNA Correspondent.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
The Cambridge Dictionary defines sport as a game, competition, or activity needing physical effort and skill that is played or done according to rules for enjoyment and/or as a job. And it defines politics as the activities of the government, members of lawmaking organizations, or people who try to influence the way a country is governed. In Indonesia, both are hotly contested, and their overlap looks set to continue at the expense of those that love the beautiful game. The TV version, CNA Correspondent, airs on CNA every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. You can also catch up with it wherever you like on cna.asia. Do like and subscribe to this podcast version that takes you behind the scenes with our correspondents. Thank you for listening. Our podcast team is made up of Sai Win, Crispina Robert, Clara Ong, and me, Steve Lai.
Did you miss your deadline to renew your Medicaid coverage? You can still send your completed annual review form to Healthy Connections Medicaid. You may be assigned to another health plan, but you can ask to come back to First Choice within 60 days of renewed Medicaid eligibility. It's your family. It's your choice. First Choice is the right choice. Renew and choose us. Visit selecthealthofsc.com/renew to learn more.